The March of Time.
On January 20th, when Dwight D. Eisenhower takes the oath of office as President of the United States, the top-to-bottom changes in government he promised during the election campaign will begin. Taking over in Washington will be an entirely new administration, headed by the Eisenhower cabinet, a team of advisors personally chosen by the new president. Today, the March of Time will introduce you to the men around Eisenhower, the men who will help guide America during the critical years ahead.
In the executive wing of the White House, in a room just next to the president's office, the cabinet meets with the president each week. The men who will sit around this table after January 20th will shape the policies of the United States government. From the very beginning of this nation, the cabinet has been an integral part of the federal government. President George Washington regularly sought the advice of these three members of the first U.S. cabinet. Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton left, shown in this painting with President Washington. Secretary of War Henry Knox seated, and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. At another critical moment in U.S. history, the start of the Civil War, the president assumed the great burden of responsibility himself and paid little attention to the advice of his cabinet. Under his firm control, the wartime emergency powers of the president were expanded. In the seven-man Lincoln cabinet, Secretary of State Seward in the foreground of this painting, and Secretary of War Stanton, seated at left, were the dominant figures. William Howard Taft was one of 8 cabinet officers who went on to become the nation's president. Taft, shown here reviewing troops at Camp Jackson near Columbia, South Carolina in 1918, was Secretary of War in the Theodore Roosevelt administration. Charles Evans Hughes, Secretary of State in the Harding and Coolidge administrations, later became Chief Justice of the United States. Herbert Hoover became the nation's president in 1929 after serving as Secretary of Commerce for Harding and Coolidge. His experience in the cabinet and as chief executive led to his concept of a plan for the reorganization of governmental agencies, still widely accepted. Henry Stimson, Secretary of War under Taft and Secretary of State under Hoover, became a Republican member of Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet. He was named Secretary of War at the same time Roosevelt appointed as Secretary of the Navy another Republican, Frank Knox. They gave Roosevelt's administration a bipartisan flavor during the tense days of World War II. At a climactic point in that global conflict, the administration of Harry Truman began. During the following 8 years, 34 cabinet officers served under Truman at one time or another. More than the number who counseled any other president in history, even Franklin Roosevelt, who was in office 4 years longer than Truman. With the beginning of a new Republican administration, an entirely new group of men will take their places around this cabinet table in the White House. But here, to less formal surroundings, aboard the USS Helena, en route across the Pacific, helicopters bring key members of the new cabinet to an extraordinary meeting with President-elect Eisenhower, returning from the Korean front. On the Helena, the Eisenhower team was off to a head start on tackling the grave problems which confront the nation as they prepare to take office. General Eisenhower anticipated the difficulties of making a transition in government and named his cabinet quickly after his sweeping election victory. When the incoming administration has been vested with the authority of office, President Eisenhower will occupy this chair at the cabinet table. In New York, the new president introduces his cabinet to the March of Time audience.
During the recent political campaign, I repeatedly pledged to the American people that in the event I was elected president, I would search every portion of this great land of ours to find the best qualified men and women to fill the important functions and positions of government. This is what I have done in selecting the cabinet. As you well know, a president of this great United States must be surrounded by helpers in whom he has implicit trust. He must know how to delegate authority, and they must be people capable of accepting authority and discharging the great responsibilities that go with it. That, again, is what I have had in mind as I've selected this cabinet, which now it is my privilege to present to you. I'm grateful that you allow me to come into your living room with them and to present each as your public servant, the public servant of the United States.
Sitting at the president's right hand will be Secretary of State John Foster Dulles.
It's the job of the State Department to help the president make foreign policy. In order to do that well, we've got to be sure that the State Department has got the confidence of the American people. That confidence, to some extent, has been lost. And the first job, as I see it, is to take steps so that the American people regain their full confidence in the State Department. There mustn't be anybody there who isn't 100% loyal, who doesn't believe that the United States is the greatest country in the world and who's going to make our traditional policy succeed. We've got to have cooperation so that the United States will speak and act with a single voice in foreign affairs behind General Eisenhower's policies. So you have to have a bipartisan foreign policy to get treaties through. And you have to get money, which takes a vote of Congress. One of the things I'm proud of is the fact that when I was working on the Japanese peace treaty with the Congress, and particularly with the Foreign Relations Committee, we had excellent cooperation. And indeed, the Foreign Relations Committee, in its unanimous report, said that never in the memory of the members of the committee had there been as good cooperation between the executive and the Senate as in relation to that Japanese peace treaty. That's a type of cooperation which I hope to keep up. That's a good tradition which I hope to preserve.
In New York, pre-inauguration headquarters of the new administration, Dulles has conferred constantly with President-elect Eisenhower to shape a positive policy of international relations. When the Secretary of the Treasury, named by General Eisenhower, takes office, a new signature will appear on the nation's currency. It will be that of George M. Humphrey, Cleveland industrialist, who, prior to his appointment, managed the vast industrial and banking interests of the M.A. Hanna Company.
I'm sure that the business community and the citizens generally must be as pleased as I am with the partners I'm going to have in running the business of the Treasury. They're thoroughly qualified and experienced in every way. With the aid of Congress, cooperation with the other departments of government, we'll be able to give you a real business administration.
Horseman Humphrey, once master of the hounds at the fashionable Chagrin Valley Hunt Club, still rides as often as his busy work schedule will permit. At his suburban Cleveland estate, Humphrey enjoys a cup of tea with his wife, the former Pamela Stark, a school-day sweetheart whom he married 40 years ago. Their 2 daughters and 1 son are married, with families of their own. To be his Secretary of Defense, the 3rd-ranking officer at the cabinet table, President-elect Eisenhower has chosen another industrialist, Charles E. Wilson of Detroit. Wilson, president of the General Motors Corporation, will bring to his new job at the Pentagon his great management ability and a new team of civilian secretaries for the armed services.
I'm very pleased with the men who have been designated for important responsibilities in the defense organization. Roger Keyes, Deputy Secretary, Bob Stevens, Secretary of the Army, Bob Anderson, Secretary of the Navy, and Harold Talbot, Secretary for Air. Secretary Lovett and myself are very anxious that the transition be made in a high-class manner. The 10 of us, and perhaps the chiefs of staff, will meet with one object in mind, the welfare of our country.
At a Washington press conference with the incumbent Secretary of Defense, Robert Lovett, Wilson sizes up for the reporters the dimensions of the job with which he is faced.
The Secretary and myself are really old acquaintances and friends, and he's just been trying to do a good job as a good American of sort of helping me to get a hold of a new job. I'm like a man who's just been drafted from the Bush League into the majors, and I don't want to talk about how many home runs and strikeouts I'm going to make. I'd like to have a little record before I talk too much.
In the Department of Justice, the new Attorney General will be Herbert Brownell, New York Attorney. As the nation's chief law enforcer and counsel to the President and the members of the Cabinet, Brownell and his department will set the moral tone of the entire Eisenhower administration. Mr. Brownell.
The work of the Department of Justice is of vital importance to every American citizen. It's the job of the Attorney General and the Department of Justice to root out communists on the domestic scene, to see that wrongdoers who have violated federal statutes are punished, to protect the civil liberties of the American citizens, to study and prosecute violations of the antitrust laws and other laws affecting the business life of the community, to protect this country against future depressions, and generally to advise the President and the Cabinet and other government officials on the legal problems which are bound to arise in connection with governing this great country of 150 million people. And so it's a real challenge to accept this new responsibility, and I hope with the aid of my assistants, men like J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, and the others who will be shortly appointed, that we will be able to serve well all of the American people.
To Mrs. Brownell, a one-time Texas Democrat, her husband's new job poses the problem of transplanting their family from New York to Washington. 16-year-old Joan, who attends a New York high school, with her 14-year-old sister Ann.
I made it. That's better than I've done.
Young Jim makes the most of this moment of leisure to test his dad's skill at the Swedish maze game.
What's the highest you ever made?
The whole family is elated over the appointment of the new Attorney General, but a little sad at the prospect of leaving their comfortable Gramercy Park home in New York.
Oops.
Oh, Jim, do it right. Good.
How far do you get up?
Can't do it. It was a 60. Big thing.
Did you?
Yes.
Wonderful. I'm having a little hard time with that first corner there.
The operation of the Post Office Department, headed by the Postmaster General, directly affects every American. Owner of one of the largest automobile agencies in the nation, Arthur Summerfield of Michigan, the new Postmaster General, is determined to build up the efficiency of the Postal Service when he takes office. Before leaving for Washington, Mr. Summerfield summarizes his program for the march of time.
To me, the post of duty represents a real call to the service of the people of this country. The improvement of all branches of the department and the increase of its morale will be my paramount objective in the public interest. One of my main objectives, of course, will be to improve the postal delivery service. The matter of 2 deliveries a day will be given thorough consideration.
At the Summerfield home on the outskirts of Flint, Michigan, the frequent visits of their grandchildren brighten the lives of Summerfield and his wife, to whom he was married in 1918 when he worked in the Chevrolet factory in Flint. Here with Summerfield's daughter-in-law and son-in-law are grandchildren Julia and Cynthia. Mary and Arthur III pose with the new Postmaster General's son and daughter.
And Daddy will Would you like it?
Awfully nice to have our little family all together this afternoon for tea, isn't it, Mother?
Wonderful.
I'm sorry
Would
it's
you like soup?
I'm sorry it's such a very bad day outside, and I hope the youngsters didn't get their little feet wet.
The work of the Department of the Interior vitally affects the West. And in Portland, a full-scale celebration was set off by the announcement that Governor Douglas McKay of Oregon would head that agency. Though moved by this display of local pride, marking the second cabinet appointment in Oregon's history, McKay retains a broad national outlook.
I realize that some people in the West will expect me to give special preference to the western location of the United States. I'm a native-born Oregonian, but if and when I become Secretary of the Interior, I shall represent the entire United States for the same reason that during my 4 years as governor of Oregon, I never showed any partiality to my hometown or to any particular county.
A veteran worker in conservation and power development, Governor McKay favors regional projects calling for a greater measure of control by the states. Mrs. McKay, whom the governor met during his college days, liked simple living. Spending an afternoon with her family is more to her liking than attending fancy parties. But the excitement of even this kind of an occasion is too much for the governor's little grandson, Danny.
Who's Papa gonna work for? Huh? Who's Papa gonna work for?
To direct the extensive programs of the Department of Agriculture, the president-elect chose Ezra Benson of Salt Lake City, a member of the governing board of the Mormon Church. A man of the soil, Benson has spent much of his life working on the problems of the farmers. Mr. Benson.
I consider it a great privilege and a great honor to be invited to serve in the new cabinet. I have no political ambitions. I did not seek the office. I accept the call humbly. I have great confidence in the rural people of America. It will be a great privilege to be closely associated with them and to serve them through the Department of Agriculture. I also have a desire to be of service to my fellow countrymen everywhere. I believe there's a great job to be done to restore confidence in the minds of our people in their own government and in the basic concepts of our way of life. To this purpose, I am happy to dedicate the years ahead.
The Benson family lives modestly, enjoying the simple pleasures afforded by the close companionship of the children. While Mark plays the piano, Mrs. Benson takes her turn at the shuffleboard and is joined by 8-year-old Flora Beth, the youngest member of the family. The Secretary of Commerce brings the viewpoint of American business to the cabinet table. This chair will be filled after January 20th by Sinclair Weeks, multimillionaire Boston businessman, whose father was Secretary of War under Harding and Coolidge.
The welfare of our people, and their welfare is all that is at stake, depends in very large measure on the condition of our business and industrial structure. As originally established, the Department of Commerce was to stimulate the development of industry, transportation, and commerce. And it shall be my constant endeavor to further this primary aim of the department.
In the Department of Labor, Martin Durkin, president of the AFL Plumbers and Pipe Fitters, will be the first union man to head that agency since Hoover's administration. The appointment came as a complete surprise to Durkin.
It was a surprise to me, having learned but a few days ago that my name was being considered for the post. I was surprised because I am a Democrat, and I supported the policy of the American Federation of Labor in the endorsement of Governor Stimson for president. I assure President-elect Eisenhower that I will do everything in my power to fulfill the duties of Secretary of Labor and aid him in making a good record as president.
It was an even greater surprise to Senator Robert Taft, who called the appointment incredible.
Well, I don't quite agree with Senator Taft. I believe that I can serve in the capacity of Secretary of Labor and give valiant service, good service to the President, and I will do everything I can to prove that Mr. Taft is wrong.
Mr. Durkin, does this criticism by Senator Taft affect your plans for a meeting with him on amending the Taft-Hartley Act?
No, it does not. I believe a meeting should be held with representatives of labor, with the senator, and try and arrive at an agreement on questions that involve a change in the Taft-Hartley law.
In the table of organization of the President's official family, there are 4 officers of sub-cabinet rank who will play important roles in the administration of President Eisenhower. Sherman Adams, an ex-lumberjack who rose to the governorship of New Hampshire, will be the assistant to the President, coordinating the flow of governmental business through the White House. Descended from the family of the early presidents, John and John Quincy Adams, the new presidential assistant will apply to his job a native Yankee efficiency.
If I perform all of the duties which are ascribed to me in these many letters, I'm sure I shall be a busy person. As a matter of fact, my work here, as I understand, will be not only to act as liaison between the President's office and the departments to a very considerable extent, also the coordination of the activities within the White House. I shall be pretty close to the boss, and that's a great thing for me, I assure you. I feel very happy about that, about anticipating that situation. You can well imagine. Also, I feel very keenly the responsibility of these duties.
Mrs. Adams, seen here with Marion, one of her 3 daughters, and grandson Tommy, has a peppery personality that flavors the whole family life of the Adamses. She once repaid the governor for morning grouchiness by putting soap in the sandwiches for his lunch. The U.S. mission which President Eisenhower sends to the United Nations will be headed by former Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. He represents the new administration's faith in the United Nations as a force for the peace of the world.
As the ambassador designate to the United Nations, it will be my intention to work under President-elect Eisenhower's directive to help make that organization an ever-increasingly effective deterrent to the outbreak of war. It has functioned effectively in that respect in several instances, and I hope that the time is not far off when it will make it no longer necessary for our young men to go off to combat in faraway places.
To manage the far-flung Mutual Security Administration, Harold Stassen has been brought into the inner circle of Eisenhower advisors. The former Minnesota governor, who more recently served as president of the University of Pennsylvania, is anxious to achieve a continuity in the Mutual Security Assistance Program during the transition from the Democratic to the new Republican administration. To effect a smooth transition in the operation of the agency, Stassen here consults on the current problems of foreign aid with the outgoing administrator of the Mutual Security Program, Averell Harriman.
As you well know, General Eisenhower has had as a cornerstone of his foreign policy the mutual security concept among the free nations, and so it will be particularly interesting and a challenge to endeavor to follow through in the work you have done and to carry on under President Eisenhower this concept of mutual security of the free nations for the obvious constructive result it means for the peace of America and of the world.
Houston, Texas newspaper publisher Oveta Culp Hobby will become Federal Security Administrator, and by order of the new president, the second woman ever to sit with the cabinet. Mrs. Hobby prepares to turn over her duties as editor and publisher of the Houston Post before leaving for Washington.
Federal Security Agency, in its broadest sense, is the human side of government, in that it directly touches the lives of each of us as individuals. I accept the assignment of President-elect Eisenhower with great humility, for I am deeply aware of its importance to the people.
Here at the White House, the people you have just met on this March of Time program will convene regularly with President Eisenhower to work out the problems facing this nation at home and abroad. Around this table, the future course of the world's history will be determined. Time marches on.
March of Time brings you each week at this hour an authoritative report on the people, the problems, and the places which will be tomorrow's news and become a significant part of the history of our time. This is Westbrook Van Voorhis, inviting you to join us again on this channel at the same hour next week, when the editors of the March of Time will present another chapter in the March of Time television series.